Okay, it's Miss Blanchard again. Sorry, there's a 15-minute video length cap. So I'm just picking up again. 5.3, Roman numeral 2. We did the first, I did the first part of A in the last video. The 13th Amendment freed slavery. It's the one that Lincoln starts pushing for in the last part of his first term. Becomes an amendment in slavery. The 14th Amendment is necessary because the 14th Amendment makes former slaves citizens. Sorry. And it's necessary because of like the Dred Scott decision that Chief Justice Taney had said African Americans and citizens and their descendants weren't actually, and African American slaves and their descendants weren't citizens. So the 14th Amendment makes them citizens. Just, kind of going forward in history, a little synthesis here is when you get to like the NAACP and the Civil Rights Movement, but also like that era leading up to the Civil Rights Movement, everything the NAACP, the legal cases and challenges they start bringing in maybe the 1920s, but especially the 30s and the early 40s, all use the 14th Amendment, maybe not all, but largely use the 14th Amendment as the basis that African Americans are being denied the equal protection of the Constitution and the equal rights as citizens. And then the 15th Amendment is for voting rights. I know citizens are supposed to have voting rights, but people find ways, states found ways around that. To me, this is very analogous, the 14th and 15th Amendments, to this 100 years later, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Sorry, I keep coughing. And how the Civil Rights Act gave African Americans rights of citizens that the 14th Amendment was supposed to, but had been continually denied them. And then the 15th Amendment is supposed to allow them and enforce the allowing of them to vote. So you kind of see that playing out twice in the beginning and end of a century. Okay, so then we have equal protection under the law and voting rights. Oh yeah, that just defines what the 13th and 14th Amendments were. Okay. So then we have B. The women's right movement was emboldened and divided over the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitutions, especially the 15th Amendment, because, and I addressed this, I think, in a couple of the classes, for women, well, okay, let's back up. African Americans and abolitionists advocates had often supported women's rights. At like the Seneca Falls Convention, Frederick Douglass is there. Because to them it was a question of not just African American rights or women's rights, but human rights and basic civil rights. So what ends up happening with the passage, especially of the 15th Amendment, and a little bit with the 14th Amendment, because many people thought the 14th Amendment would give African Americans the right to vote because it was ensuring them their civil rights, which a lot of women in some states still had basic civil rights denied to them, is the question of, do we support this now with the hope that then African American men will help women get equal rights as citizens and the right to vote later? Or do we hold up on it until it includes everyone? So it's not that women didn't think African Americans should get the right to vote, or at least it's not that women who supported women's suffrage. There are certainly, I'm sure, some women back there who did not think men, African Americans should get the right to vote. The question was, do we support this now with the hope that they'll help us, or do we hold off until we find something that's inclusive? And so I think I've explained this a couple times in class, how you have NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. The name is a byproduct of that, because they the women's movement splits over this question, and they form a National Women's Suffrage Association and American Women's Suffrage Association. One wanting, and I don't even know the difference without looking it up, and so therefore you definitely don't know the difference. One supporting passing the 14th and 15th Amendments now, and African American men will help women get the right to vote later, and the other one supporting, let's wait until it's all inclusive. After they're ratified, it really doesn't make any difference, so that's when they come back together and get the very confusing name of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Okay, On to C. Efforts by radical and moderate Republicans to challenge the balance of power between Congress and the presidency and to reorder race relations in the defeated South yielded some short-term successes. Okay, so especially radical Republicans want to see African Americans kind of given a lot of rights and that they had been denied under slavery, and in some ways like helping try to do more social inclusivity things like the Freedmen's Bureau and education, and helping to get African Americans elected to positions of power in the South. Moderate Republicans were sometimes not so progressive on like this racial ideology or racial equality, and instead just kind of wanted to see the reconstruction of the government, though sometimes supported things like the Freedmen's Bureau and universal education. So challenge to the balance of power between Congress and the presidency. So a lot of that is going to come to fruition in Johnson's impeachment. Johnson wants to fire his Secretary of War. Congress passes a law called the Tenure of Office Act, making it illegal for Johnson to do that without the consult of Congress, and knowing that he's going to do it. And when Johnson then violates the Tenure of Office Act, they try and impeach him. It ends up being that the law is found unconstitutional. So the Constitution says presidents have to have advice and consent of the Congress, but to hire and to make appointments, but not to fire people. But this is all part of that back and forth. And so you should look up in your book because it's pretty basic and just read it over. This is the difference between congressional Reconstruction and presidential Reconstruction. Lincoln has a presidential Reconstruction plan. The 10% plan sets the bar very low for states to re-enter the Union. He wants to just preserve the Union. Johnson is a Southerner who hates the rich slaveocracy. Because he's a poor Southerner or had a poor background, and kind of blames some of the slaveocracy, the large landowning elites, for the war in many ways. So he suggests a more punitive plan, the 50% plan, making the bar much higher for the states to re-enter the Union. And then there's the Congressional Reconstruction Plan. And the Congressional Plan is really the one that wins out. The Wade Davis bill, and look, just kind of review that. It's pretty basic information, just so you're kind of familiar with what happens. It's usually not on the test all that specifically. And so Congress kind of wins out, and what you see is after the end of the Civil War, Lincoln shot a month into his second term, but you'll not have any other president until Wilson elected to 2 consecutive terms. You have where it goes Cleveland, Harrison, Cleveland, 2 non-consecutive terms, and then don't forget Teddy Roosevelt. He serves McKinley's second term, nearly all of it, and then he's elected. But because in this power balance relationship between Congress and the presidency, Congress really wins out, and you have a strong Congress through most of the Gilded Age, although they are kind of a laissez-faire Congress, and not until Roosevelt do you really have like this string of weak executives. Okay, let's go to the second half. Reconstruction opened up political opportunities and other leadership roles to former slaves. So remember at the beginning of the year when we did that debate, there were pictures of former slaves who are elected to offices in the South, Congress, Senate. After Reconstruction ends, they won't even be holding any elected positions in the South because they're denied their right to vote and therefore cannot elect African Americans anymore to any offices. So there is a short term, I don't want to say heyday, but they do serve in Congress. You have short-term short-term successes, but nearly all the legislation that they pass will be even repealed once the end of Reconstruction, and with the rise of the KKK using intimidation factors to prevent African Americans from voting, and then eventually holding office. So then the second part of that says, but it ultimately failed. do both to determine Southern resistance and the North's waning involvement. And we saw that on one of the review tests we took about Reconstruction ends just because the North is just tired of fighting it. They realize they can legally reconstruct the South, but they can't socially reconstruct the South. The Second Industrial Revolution is starting. A lot of their energy just goes back up north because they just feel like they're hitting a brick wall in the South. So that ends with the Compromise of 1877, where they kind of just say to the South, listen, if you just let Hayes win the election, which is the Northern candidate, we'll just let Reconstruction be over. And so the last three states are legally reconstructed and added to the Union, and the North just kind of gives up and goes on with life. So much for the radical Reconstruction. Okay, and then D, Southern plantation owners continued to own the majority of the region's land even after Reconstruction. Former slaves sought land ownership but generally fell short of self-sufficiency, and as an exploitative and soil-intensive sharecropping system, limited blacks and poor whites to access to land in the South. Okay, so during the war, when Sherman burns Atlanta and marches to the sea, he had also confiscated some land and declared this policy of 40 acres and a mule at Sherman's Special Field Order, I think 15. That never ends up happening. Slaves will not get 40 acres and a mule. You'll hear slaves say, like, hey, we should get 40 acres and a mule. It's never going to happen. And what ends up happening is the sharecropping system, where they become tenant farmers on their owner's land, or the plantation owner's land. No land ownership changes place. The big landowners in 1855 are going to be the big landowners in 1870 and 75 and 80 and 85. And there's basically a system in which the landowner tallies up secretly everything, and at the end of the year they say, hey, look, this year we broke even. You don't owe me anything. I don't owe you anything. Let's just start again last year, or let's start again next year. And so it's basically legalized slavery again. It's there's going to be laws in the South preventing African American sharecroppers from terminating their contract and moving on to other plantations, to moving up north. So when people say, oh, why didn't slaves just leave the South? Well, A, they can't get any money to get ahead, to spend all the money that it takes to leave the South, train tickets, and things like that. But also, in many cases, they're legally prevented. Here, you'll notice too is shaded out. It's just continued. So lastly is E, segregation, the growth of Jim Crow, violence, the KKK, Supreme Court decisions. It's probably talking about here like the slaughterhouse cases, and local political tactics progressively stripped away African American rights, but the 14th, 15th Amendments eventually became the basis for court decisions upholding civil rights in the 20th century. Hey, I already said that, didn't I? Okay. I would know here the KKK. I really don't think you need to know the slaughterhouse cases. Just know that. The Supreme Court decisions. Oh, and we talked about Plessy v. Ferguson. That's the one you could know. Instead, strip away African Americans' rights, what little gains they made. Oh, hey, look, we're done. Okay. If I were you and wanted to review stuff, I would maybe, you'll see a lot of these reiterated, but you could use the front page to make a timeline. You could also go through these thematic learning objectives, focus of exam questions. So these are often change in continuity over time, cause and effect, to what extent did something change the relationship or change something, the basis for those types of questions. For example here, now this is back on the very first page, page 58. Analyze how ideas about national identity changed in response to U.S. involvement in international conflicts and the growth of the United States. So that would be anything. What international conflicts did I talk about in here? I guess just the Mexican-American War. Annexing new land in the West, how Native Americans and Mexican Americans are still excluded. We had talked about that very, very briefly in class. But then how the growth of the United States, right, this question of slavery, moving into the territories. I think you could even work in questions of African American identity as American citizens change with the 14th and 15th Amendments, but then stripped away from them post-Reconstruction. So some of these might just be things to think about. It kind of takes